So, hello everyone and welcome to this Study of Religions Department guest lecture on the religious experience of whisky. By way of introduction to Rachel McCormack, our guest speaker today. She's a writer and broadcaster, a regular contributor to BBC Radio 4's The Kitchen Cabinet. She's also a reviewer on BBC Radio Scotland's The Shireen Show, and presented her own television documentary, The Ideal Scotsman, on BBC Scotland. A few years ago, she persuaded a London publisher that going around Scotland, drinking whisky and writing about it was a good idea, and Chasing the Dram, The Search for the Spirit of Whisky, was published in 2017, which became a book of the year for The New Statesman, The Herald and The Telegraph. She currently lives near Glasgow and says that apart from the people in her household, has only seen crows in real life since Christmas, a similar situation for many of us. So you're very welcome, Rachel, so take it away.
Thank you very much, Jenny. So, if we're going to talk about the religious experience of whisky, and if you drink whisky and you have any whisky in your house, now is the time that you need to get one, because you can't really have listened to an entire hour about discussion about whisky without a whisky. Now, the whisky that I have today is from the Dingle Distillery. It's a single malt whisky from County Kerry, and it's right on the south coast of Ireland, and it's whisky with an E. Scotch whisky is always whisky without an E, and Irish whisky is always whisky with an E. There are reasons for that we will go into later. So this has been triple distilled, and it's been put in casks with bourbon, Pedro Jimenez sherry, and Madeira. So, if you have your whisky with you, what I'd like you to do is have a look at it. Have a look at it, and you can see the caramel colours. There's always a yellow to a kind of dark brown, kind of sherry colour to a whisky. And I want you to have a smell and see the kind of smells that you get. With whisky, you get like citrus smells. Sometimes you get green grass smells. Some whiskies smell really, really smoky. Some smell very light. Some smell quite salty. They smell quite briny. And then I want you to close your eyes and sit back while you're smelling your whisky and imagine that you live on a tiny farm 2,000 years ago in Ireland or in Scotland, and someone told you that this was barley that they'd heated, water and yeast. You would find that really hard to believe. You would imagine that there was some kind of magic involved in the process to take barley, water and yeast that came from the gods, because it came from the air, into making this. And one of the first things I'd like to start off with is an extract from a book on Scotch whisky by Neil Gunn. Now, Neil Gunn was one of the great Scottish writers of the 30s, and this book is from 1935. And he wrote this book about whisky. And I'm just going to read you a couple of pages from it, because it's sort of an entrance. Whisky comes from the Gaelic Ushkabea, meaning water of life. In the curious mind, this will at once rouse wonder, perhaps even a contemplative effort to surprise the ancestral thought in its creative moment. For clearly there is nothing haphazard or transitory about the designation. It was not coined for the slang or commerce of any age. Rather, it is akin to one of the ultimate elements into which ancient philosophers resolved the universe. It is not a description so much as a simple statement of truth and of mystery. It is now possible to conceive by what process some long dead mouth and tongue were led to breathe out the magic syllables upon the liqueur's aftermath. Down round the south corner of the dun, there was a field of barley, all ripened by the sun. In a small wind it echoed faintly the sound of the ocean. At night it sighed and rustled, as the earth mother thought over things, not without a little anxiety. It was cut and harvested, and a sheaf offered in thanksgiving. flailed and winnowed until the ears of the grain remained in a heap of pale gold, the bread of life. In simple ways, the grain was prepared and ground and set to ferment. The fermented liquor was then boiled, and as the steam came off, it was by happy chance condensed against some cold surface. And lo, this condensation of the steam from the greenish yellow fermented gruel is clear as crystal. It is purer than any water from any well. When cold, it is colder to the fingers than ice. A marvellous transformation, a perfect water. But in the mouth, what is this? The gums tingle, the throat burns, down into the belly fire passes, and thence outward to the fingertips, to the feet, and finally to the head. The man was a bit tired, exasperated a little, for things had been going wrong. How often they must have gone wrong with the primitive experimenter. And, for the rest, or he wouldn't have been at the job, not a little weary with the dullness of social life, including the looks of women and the ambition of fools. And then the head goes up. The film dissolves from the eyes. They glisten. He abruptly laughs and jumps to his feet, as abruptly pauses to look over himself with a marvellous scrutiny. He tries the muscles of his arms. They are full of such energy that one fist shoots out, then the other, a right and left. His legs have the same energy. He begins to dance with what is called primitive abandon. Clearly, it was not water he had drunk. It was life. I know this is a rather poetic reconstruction to be regarded with proper amusement, yet it is difficult to understand any history without some exercise of the imagination. What meaning can a human fact have until it is comprehended in thought and feeling? Let us pursue the method a little further. Now, I would say let us not, because one of the fundamental problems that Neil Gunn has about whisky in Scotland is he assumes that it was invented by a man. And that is not actually true. Mostly, Neil's book, to be honest, I had to read this as research. If you ever get the chance to read Neil Gunn's Whisky in Scotland, don't read it. It's really dull, but it's very poetic, and it's in that kind of twee way of the 1930s. So save yourself the trouble. I've done it for you. But a book that is very good to read if you're interested in whisky at all is Women and Whisky by a bourbon writer called Fred Minnick. And he starts to talk about the origins of whisky in distilling. Because essentially, if you look at whisky, it's bad beer that is then reboiled. In the extract from Neil Gunn, you can hear what he talks about is fermenting the barley with the water and the yeast, and then you take that beer and then you boil it, and then you cool the steam, and you end up with whisky. So at its basis, whisky is boiled beer. And the first evidence of women making beer is to be found in Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets dating around 4000 BC. Many anthropologists believe that women cultivated barley for beer, not bread. In 1950, Leo Oppenheim, a distinguished Assyrianologist, published a tablet from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York that included 160 terms about beer manufacturing. The brewer's craft is the only profession in Mesopotamia which derives divine protection and social sanction from a goddess. In fact, from two female figures of the pantheon, Ninkasi and Cyrus. So already you can really see that even something like beer, which is nowadays is just something that everybody drinks in pubs and bars and is just a normal drink, was seen as something divine. And Sumerians used beer for religious rituals, medicine, and a normal beverage, drinking through large straws in jars. According to recovered plaques thought to be from 2550 to 2400 BC, women sipped beer during the sorrow of funerals and through to the orgasmic enjoyment of sexual intercourse. Gods and goddesses enjoyed beer too. At one banquet, deities were seated before the beer jug, and to not know how to drink beer meant one was uncivilized. Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, occasionally became intoxicated, and his daughter, the goddess Ninkasi, presided over all beer manufacturing. So really, from very early days, you have this idea of beer itself, just alcohol itself, being something divine. And if you look at the moving sort of slightly westward to the Greeks and the Romans, they had this idea of wine being something divine, that women weren't supposed to drink, in the way that the Mesopotamians, women made the beer, and the person overseeing beer manufacture was a goddess. In Greek and ancient Rome, they didn't like women drinking wine, and they could be very heavily sanctioned for drinking wine. But again, wine was seen as something holy. A lot of the times, if you have an animal sacrifice, you also have a libation, and you will pour some wine out as a sacrifice to the gods, in a way that I can't really see you ever doing that with water. You know, it's not necessarily, it's this idea of taking grapes or taking grain and making some alcohol with it that somehow makes it into something much more important in religious terms. Now, Minnick goes on quite a bit after the Greeks and Romans about distillation. I mean, the next step, once you have your beer, then really the next step of making whiskey is distillation. And many scholars believe that the first chemists were two Mesopotamian women. Because most chemistry apparatuses were derived from kitchen utensils, it makes sense that women were the first chemists. And I always find it really interesting that when you had things like post the 19th century Industrial Revolution, at least in the UK, you have this idea that Neil has that whiskey was made by men and for men, and the origins of whiskey was always men, when again it was women, because that makes more sense if you look at the apparatus, you know, the instruments you use at its most basic for distillation. They just look like kitchen things. Now, one of the things that when you look at that idea of distillation is the essence of something. I mean, if you smell a whiskey, if you smell your whiskey again, and you can always get a slight smell of the grain and how that's been made. And it's like the distillation process brings out the essence of alcohol, the essence of the things that you've used, which is alchemy. And again, alchemists' ideas were very much about turning base metal into gold, but also finding the essence of life. Because if they could find the essence of life and sort of religious experience, then essentially we could become immortal, or we could really properly understand the world. And again, I think, you know, if you can, there's been a recent experiment in Waterford whiskey about whether whiskey has terroir or not, and it's really interesting to look up. And part of that, you can see it's like a really important sort of thing in the whiskey industry right now is, does distilling the barley from this farm in these circumstances give you a different taste from distilling the barley from that farm in exactly the same way? Does it mean that whiskey has terroir, and does it mean that the essence that you are distilling is different from one place to another? Now, that really does strike me as quite obsessive, but it has that sort of religious element to it of, can we get the absolute essence of something, of the barley from this field, and is it different from the essence of the barley in this field? Now, moving on, women were really the original chemists, and they were the original alchemists. But as per usual, nobody really liked that very much in the end. It kind of, women got pushed out slowly of distilling, and because it was kind of began to be seen as witchcraft, and a lot of the time you'd find that monks would take over. And again, you know, making whiskey and distilling was medicine that monks were in charge of, and if women were in charge of it, then they would become witches. And the very first, let me see, with this book from Charles MacLean, the very first record of whisky in Scotland was a postcard where Friar John Core, by order of King James VI, was called on to make aquavitae, and he had to pay tax on 8 balls of malt, which was about 150 kilos, I think. So again, you've got that idea that it's monks making whisky, and whisky being used for medicine, and it being very much under religious control as opposed to it kind of being out in the world. And this, I suppose, continues a lot until, well, into Scotland it kind of stopped obviously with the Reformation, but I would you can see it in a lot of monasteries in Europe still. If you look at like Chartreuse is made by Carthusian monks. There's a lot of European liquors, distilled liquors, that are very much made by monks, and they're seen as almost sort of part of their religious duty is to make that. It was to make that a distilled drink because it was a medicine for people, for the people near the monastery. And if we move on from that, though, there is an issue that happened in Scotland, really, that sort of religious life kind of got separated from whisky because it just became things that were done on farms. It was nothing to do with monks anymore because we really didn't have any. But then there was the whole issue of illegal distilling of whisky. That the problem was that really the government wasn't interested in how badly or how well you made whisky. They just wanted money from it, and the law didn't really change to make small farm distilleries viable legally until about 1835. But then you have the problem where religion then steps in again of industrialisation. So you have so many people moving from the countryside to the cities. You have cities like Glasgow, which are overcrowded and are poor, and you have this experience of everybody a lot of the times really drinking vast quantities of incredibly bad alcohol to cope with the circumstances of their life in cities. And then what happens is that the temperance movement then kicks off. And the temperance movement in Ireland was very, very big and had a big impact on the production of whisky in Ireland, but it was also really very big in Scotland. And I wanted to read about how religious the temperance movement was and how much whisky particularly kind of got involved in being seen as of the devil and evil. And let me see where this starts. So you can see the drink culture. No, one of the things I wanted to say before that is that one of the things that's really noticeable when looking at the history of Scotland is that in Enlightenment Scotland in the 18th century in Edinburgh, everybody who was upper class was drinking 4 and 5 bottles of claret a day. Now, they weren't as big bottles as we drink, and their percentage of alcohol was a lot less, but still, 4 bottles of claret a day is a lot of claret. But if you were a judge, if you were a lawyer, if you were upper middle class or upper class Edinburgh gentleman, that was very funny and that was absolutely fine. The minute it starts being the Glasgow poor that starts spending all the time drunk on bad alcohol, it becomes a problem. And this book is by the historian Tom Devine, and it's about the Scottish nation. And this is his take on the temperance movement. The drink culture in Scotland had 2 distinctive features in addition to the huge quantities of alcohol that were already consumed. First, whisky was becoming more popular than ale and stout from the later 18th century. The alcohol content of beer was around 1/8 that of whisky, some of which was distilled illegally as poteen in the cities by migrants who had learned their skills in the Highland glens and in the depths of the Irish countryside. Whisky did not necessarily replace beer, but was often consumed in combination with it. A favourite tipple, for instance, was a schooner and a stick, a cocktail consisting of a pint of beer with a glass of whisky added for additional impact. The significant increase in the drinking of hard spirits helps to explain the wave of intoxication that swept across several lowland towns in this period, because, as several commentators pointed out, the level of whisky consumption always rose in years of good trade when people had more money in their pockets. A second characteristic of the drink culture in Scotland was the widespread availability of alcohol. In England, the Beer Act of 1830 made it illegal for beerhouses to sell spirits. But this did not apply to Scotland, where public houses, at this time often little more than rooms in private houses, sold both, as did grocers, drapers, and eating houses. Yet cost and availability were only part of the story. Heavy drinking also had cultural and social roots. Drinking was an integral part of all social intercourse. Weddings, christenings, and funerals often occasioned feats of heroic drinking, as did the annual celebration of New Year. Hiring fairs for servants were also notorious for scenes of intoxication on the grand scale. There were numerous social usages, such as completion of a job, end of an apprenticeship, or the sealing of a bargain, when the consumption of copious amounts of alcohol was regarded as both necessary and desirable. The pub itself had a much wider social role in Victorian times than today. It was a meeting place for early trade unions, political organisations, and friendly societies. Until the truck legislation of 1870s, the paying of wages in pubs was common, and they long remained places for the hiring of casual labourers. All Scottish cities teemed with migrants, and for single men in particular away from home in lodgings or flitting from one temporary house to another, the pub was not simply a drinking place, but an ideal social centre and source of companionship. The slum pub must also be seen in the context of Victorian street life. The emphasis was not necessarily on the family home, which was small, bereft of anything other than the simplest furnishings and overcrowded, but on the informal life of the streets, with the pubs offering drink, fellowship, and entertainment. Now, this I want to say about pubs has actually continued right up until the late 20th century at the very least. When I was a teenager, I was an evangelical Christian, and one of the things that they used to say to us then was that the pub was the devil's church, because one of the biggest things that the church would offer would be fellowship and companionship, and you would feel part of belonging to the church and belonging to this body. And what they felt was that there was a danger that the pubs up the road were doing it better than the church. And you can see that that stems from that 19th century idea of what the pub offered to people in cities in Scotland. Imagine the dram shop's impact on a tired and bored working man fleeing from his drab home, nagging wife or landlady, and crying children. Some pubs also had entertainment. The Free and Easy, the forerunner of the music hall, was a room in a public house with a platform and a piano, where the company could be entertained to a programme of sentimental, comic, and bawdy songs. So this is one of the issues that you can see, that there was a problem where essentially the best fellowship, the best companion, the best time was being had in the pub. And there was just this idea that it was becoming a problem. And I would say, there is a point today where, you can still see that it is a problem in Glasgow. Well, and I think also it's a problem in Ireland is our attitude to alcohol and how much we consume it and how much it means to us and how it means so much to us more than religion does nowadays. The scale of alcoholic consumption in Scotland in the 1830s and the 1840s was bound to provoke a reaction when evangelicalism became a dominant force in the Church of Scotland. Drinking started to be regarded as a social problem, as statistical surveys revealed seemingly unending and dramatic increases in consumption. A report to Parliament on the numbers arrested for drunkenness between 1831 and 1852 described Glasgow as the worst city in the kingdom, the Presbyterian Rome and the modern Gomorrah, with every 22nd person in Glasgow once a year taken drunk to the police office. This meant that Glasgow is 3 times more drunken than Edinburgh and 5 times more drunken than London. Various reactions came in the form of the temperance movement, whose supporters saw drink as a fundamental cause of crime and degradation. The misery of the poor was blamed not on economic and social curses, but on the gross abuse of alcohol. But working class reformers, including many Charterists, were also passionately committed to the campaign against the demon drink because they believed that only a sober radicalism would be effective. The anti-spirits movement was launched in the late 1820s by leading evangelical laymen such as John Dunlop, a Greenock magistrate who had written a major study of Scottish drinking customs, and William Collins, the noted Glasgow publisher. But the campaign did not meet with immediate success, as it was split between those who advocated teetotalism and those who supported drinking in moderation. There was greater progress by the 1840s, as demonstrated by the famous visit to Scotland of the charismatic Irish champion of temperance, Father Theobald Matthew, in 1842. Not only did he address an enthusiastic crowd of around 50,000 in Glasgow Green, he was also feted by the leaders of Scottish temperance and managed to receive the pledge of abstinence from an estimated 40,000 of his fellow Irishmen who had settled in Scotland. In the same decade, both the Church of Scotland and the Free Church of Scotland adopted the temperance cause. Now, the Free Church of Scotland continues to adopt the temperance cause, and most of the people in the Free Church of Scotland are nowadays, there are some in Glasgow, but most of them are now on really they only really remain on the Isle of Lewis, and it's a really, really big thing as part of their religion that they do not drink. And there's always the joke about a Free Church of Scotland minister who takes two worms and puts one in a glass of whiskey and one in a glass of water, and always has the hellfire and brimstone preaching sermon about the evils of drink. And then he picks up the worm that's in the water and it's fine, and he picks up the worm that's in the whiskey and it's dead, and he says, can you see what this means to everybody in the congregation? And there's always an old guy that shouts out, yes, if you've got worms you should drink whiskey. So it is a very well known thing about religious people in Scotland not drinking whiskey. And I would say now with evangelical Christians, it's a very similar thing about not drinking. Becomes almost like an article of faith. It's a way you demonstrate outwardly your religious fervour. Now, there's another thing you could also, an aspect about whiskey that is slightly less edifying, as these things can always be in Scotland and Ireland, which is the sort of the way that politics ends up in sectarianism as well. Because one of the things that happens in Ireland once you get independence is part of the problem is the decline of Irish whiskey distilling, which now it's going great. Dingle is is the first what's the word? I've forgotten. Artisanal. It's one of the first craft distillers. They're going really well. Irish whiskey's exports are the fastest growing drinks market in Europe. But in about around the 1930s, it was basically just collapsing. And one of the problems was that the Irish whiskey industry was seen by the government was pretty much as a unionist industry, and they weren't actually that interested in them. And part of the reason I think was because a lot of the whiskey industry in Ireland at the time, they were Protestants, and so the Irish government wasn't really that bothered about keeping them going and supporting them. And that kind of actually goes on to individual behaviour in Scotland and in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. Maybe not so much now, but a friend of mine who's in his 50s was telling me that he had an uncle who was in the Orange Lodge in Leith in Edinburgh, and he liked whiskey, but he liked whiskey, but he didn't drink an awful lot. But he once got a bottle of Jameson's and he would never drink it because it was the Catholic whiskey. He had it in his house and he would never touch it. And again, you kind of can see how much that sort of religious divide goes right down to what you're willing to drink. I mean, I always thought growing up in Glasgow it was more to do with what colour you were willing to put on, but it turns out it's also what whiskey you're willing to drink. Now, I would like to move on now. We're talking about the past and then about the temperance movement. Actually, one of the things one of the things I would like to also say about the temperance movement is that the temperance movement was successful with the middle classes, and also with women. And in the end, what they really seemed to do, at least in Glasgow, was it just turned pubs into really nasty drinking dens. So it actually aggravated the problem rather than making it better. So you would have this idea of, you know, women taking the pledge and women not drinking, and therefore pubs just sort of descended into really, really nasty places, which has taken a long time, I would say, for pubs in Glasgow to recover from really the effects, the bad effects of the temperance movement. Now, before we move on, I would like to move on to the modern world, but before we do that, I want to take a very, very brief look at, because I promised you that I would, a really brief look at Sufis, because there's a thing about Sufi poetry that always has wine in it. And I remember years ago listening to a friend of mine had these Qawwali tapes, which is Qawwali, can't remember how to pronounce it. The Qawwali tapes, which were a lot of Sufi music from Pakistan. And I was listening to it, and obviously I didn't understand any of the words, and it sounded amazing. And she came in and she was telling me, oh no, this means that, you know, they're drinking wine and they're full of wine, and this is how they're feeling, totally intoxicated, and they're overflowing with wine. And I was thinking, when did Muslims drink wine and be overflowing with wine? And a lot of people want to say that it's that idea of intoxication and in terms of finding God, and it all just being purely symbolic. But there is an article from 2011 in The Guardian by a writer called Khalid Diab, who wrote A Drinker's Guide to Islam. And one of the things he says is that, let me find it, that in wider Arab and Muslim context, booze is widely available. Although alcohol is generally considered to be haram in Islam, only the most conservative countries actually impose a legal ban on it. Egypt, for instance, has a booming local alcohol industry that has been growing for years. This is not just a recent innovation, as conservative Muslims might believe. The prominent 19th century Orientalist Edward William Lane, famous for his incredibly observant, if somewhat condescending book, Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians, provides in one of his lesser known works some fascinating details about the drinking habits of Egyptians. From the conversations and writings of Arabs, he notes, drinking wine in private and by select parties is far from uncommon among modern Muslims. And there is plenty of historical evidence to back up Lane's assertions. Numerous prominent Muslims throughout ages drank alcohol. Pre-Islamic poetry is famous for its odes to wine, and this tradition continued into the Islamic era. Take Abu Nawas, Harun al-Rashid's camp court poet. In addition to his homoerotic ghazal, he penned endless verse in praise of wine. Although he was considered to be the greatest Arab poet ever during his lifetime, Nawas has fallen out of favour with the modern Muslim reader, but he is not alone in taking up the virtues of drink. Modern-day Puritans will argue that Khayyam and Rumi used wine and drunkenness as metaphor for spiritual intoxication, but there is no reason why their poetry should not be read both literally and figuratively, as mystics have long used alcohol. After all, we do use the term spirit to describe some drinks and other drugs to alter their consciousness in pursuit of the divine. And I think that, again, that's actually really common if you look at a lot of this idea of being intoxicated on God. A lot of that mystical experience is about having an altered state of consciousness, and I would imagine that in a lot of places alcohol does play a part in that. But the very last thing I wanted to say is about the modern experience of whiskey as a religion that I found when I was researching my book, Chasing the Dram. And one of the things I really, really noticed was how much pilgrimage is such an integral part of who we are, and how for a lot of people, going around whisky distilleries in Scotland is a similar experience for them as a pilgrimage. And sometimes I was looking at their reactions and how excited they were and how much they had prepared for this, to be in this certain distillery, drinking this certain whisky at a certain time, and just how overawed they were. And it really struck me that it was probably very much like somebody going from a village in Kent and walking 100 miles to Canterbury in the medieval times and having that same experience. And that idea of people walking along with you and joining you in part of that route, and it being that fellowship of whisky. And again, you can see that with whisky people when they get together and how they talk, or even if they're in clubs. My last point would be about the religious experience of whisky. My very last point will be, I met somebody at the Glasgow Whisky Club who works in retail, and his passion is whisky, and he doesn't drink a lot, but he talks about it all the time. He drinks his whisky, he spends a lot of money on whisky. And he was talking to me about how his boss didn't really understand what he did. And I'm like, well, what is it that you do that your boss doesn't understand? Well, he doesn't really understand me. And I'm like, what is it that he doesn't understand? Well, he doesn't understand about whisky. And I sort of looked at him and I was left going, this is like somebody religious with a religion explaining that they're working with other people that don't have the same religion as them, or aren't religious like them, trying to explain that they feel an outsider because their religion is whisky. This is what they spend their time doing. And I had never met anybody before. And then I realised, talking to more and more of the people in that whisky group, that was their religion. It was their fellowship, was the whisky club. Their life was knowing about different types of whiskies, getting involved in it. And for them, it did give them this religious experience that as a teenager I had in the evangelical church. And it was really similar. And that is me finished my talk. So if you have any questions, if you would like to put them in the chat.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And that was fascinating. I just have a quick comment before people can be writing their questions in the chat, or can put up their hand, whichever they prefer. I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about the different views of people who drink whiskey in Scotland, because I think in Ireland, maybe connected to the struggle for independence and then the celebration of St. Patrick's Day, it's been really romanticized. There are stories that connect St. Patrick to whiskey and the whole kind of Irish American thing, like drink till you're Irish, or making a coffee Irish, the Irish coffees and the whiskey, and the whole debate about where that started. So I think it's kind of almost a romantic thing, or it's used in the advertising of whiskey here as well, the kind of images of Ireland that are very similar to what would be used by the tourist board, Fáilte Ireland. So I was thinking as well, as you were talking about the time Lady Gaga, the singer, came to Ireland when she was doing her shows here, and she visited the old Jameson distillery in Dublin, and she said she it was in all the papers here anyway, that she drinks Jameson when she's on stage, and she said it was her longtime boyfriend. So that really kind of sparked interest in Irish whiskey as well, among a particular demographic. So I'm just looking in the
I think there's a romanticism about whiskey, but there's so much you can talk about whiskey and whiskey culture, that I wasn't really sure that was a particularly religious experience, because I found, the Irish are really good at selling whiskey, but we're still better, and we use Highland cows and hills and tartan and bagpipes until they are coming out of our ears constantly to sell, to the rest of the world. It's what we do, and the Irish are really, I think the Irish have been really successful at selling themselves around the world, and there's that romanticism of it. But I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure how much that could be compared to a religious experience.
I think it just ties in with probably the Catholic identity and everything that becomes co-stereotyped with St. Patrick and Patrick's Day. So yeah, I was just going on a tangent with Lady Gaga, which is
because I
nothing
was
to do
wondering
with
about that,
religion.
because see, we don't. I mean, again, you know, we don't do, for example, we don't do St Andrew's Day, because we're Presbyterian and we don't do saints, and whenever we see St Patrick's Day, there's quite a lot of people go, you know, we are really stupid, we should be doing St Andrew's Day, but because look at how well the Irish, we should really be learning from the Irish about what they do about St Patrick's Day, where everybody's Irish in the whole world, you know, and for a day, no matter where they are, and we don't do that. But what we do is we we have in January where we celebrate Robert Burns' birthday, so we have a poet, and we have that massive thing at the end of January, which in some ways is quite clever because so many people do dry January. By the time it comes to 24th, they've had enough and they want a drink. In which case, the whole of the Scotch whisky industry goes, well, come and have one of ours and have a party. And I suppose that's the difference. I think, you know, with Catholicism making saints being such a thing. Because the thing again, as we're talking about pilgrimages, was that there's a pilgrimage to, in the south of Spain, to like the Virgin of the Rocío in Huelva, and everybody goes on this pilgrimage, and you look at it in television, that is a party. That is one, everybody gets dressed up in all the old Andalusian country outfits, and they're all in carriages or they're walking, and they're sleeping out in the open, and you can just tell by looking that, you know, that is not what Presbyterians would define as a religious experience. That is just one big party. That is more like going down to Distillery or going to Glastonbury than a very pious experience.
I'm just, thanks for explaining about that. I'm just, I don't want to hog the time with my comments. So Rachel Woodlock, will I read out your comment, or would you prefer to say it yourself?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say thank you. That was very interesting. I was going to say further to the observations about sort of Muslim cultures and drinking, and I think it, you know, because there is this misperception that Westerners have when they look towards Muslim cultures, is that somehow they are more religious or overly religious or are solely defined by religiosity, and don't recognise that, you know, what was written down in the theological books about alcohol being prohibited was not necessarily practiced in Muslim cultures, that Muslims drank and they socialised in non-religious ways, even though the theologians would have been aghast by it. So I think that over misperception of over religiosity is a category of error thinking, not one that you're making, but I think ones that, you know, that obviously, because it has placed. I think a man one time pointed out that there is some sculptures and some decorative wine bowls that you can find that's come out of historical Muslim cultures. So clearly these were taking place. These were activities that were taking place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I found interesting about that article, because, you know, to put it mildly, I'm not an expert on Islam and alcohol. And I like that article for him pointing out that these things have always existed, and that modern views by Westerners about what Islam is and what Islam has been and is are very, very different.
Yeah, definitely. But thank you so much. It was such an interesting talk.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? You can put up your hand or type in the chat. So Elizabeth? You might be on mute, are you?
Yes, yeah, sorry. Rachel, that was so interesting. I just had a question. If you've ever looked at the social life of whiskey that is spread to Greece and Athens, because I lived there for a year, and it's a huge kind of social identity there with the Rebecca Code.
In what ways?
It's in the nightclubs. So it's usually associated kind of with like a sense of masculinity, but then when women drink it, it becomes a sign of kind of liberation. So, and if like there's a whole custom of like buying the bottle at the nightclub and dancing until you're like in an altered state. But it's interesting because it's rather new there. But I was wondering if you had any experience with that. And then I had a comment that I've actually tried the Mesopotamian beer. My father made it.
Really? What's it like?
It's delicious. It's effervescent, which I'm not like an expert, so, but it almost like rose, like almost like a soda pop. So
you could imagine that it had been blessed by a Mesopotamian goddess then.
it was really refreshing.
That's amazing. Yeah. So just saying, the thing I have noticed here in Scotland is that if you're in a whiskey pub and there are young women in the pub drinking whiskey, they are almost always foreign. And I think it has, and when my book came out, the only women that sent me emails were quite young foreign women, and I wondered how much of that is to do with them seeing how whiskey's been seen as a man's drink, or alcohol, distilled alcohol being seen as a man's drink, and them kind of claiming modernity because there's so much in the whiskey world that's really interesting. The barrels and the way things are distilled, and and then there's the whiskey tourism in both Ireland and Scotland. That I wonder how much it is with younger women in sort of non-Scottish younger women kind of claiming that for themselves as a sign of their own sophistication. Because generally, if you see women in a pub in Scotland drinking whiskey, they're part of the industry. They really know what they're talking about. They're not just casual drinkers.
It's interesting too with the history you're tracing that it's almost a reclaiming.
Mm-hmm. Well, the same with beer. A friend of mine, Melissa Cole, does an awful lot with beer, and you're thinking, until the Industrial Revolution, women made beer. If you look at Chaucer, it's the brewers were women; they weren't men.
Thank you. It's so interesting. I wish I had whiskey, but.
So we're close to the end. So a final question or comment from Kieran, and we'll try and fit in Maria's as well afterwards.
Hello, Rachel. Thanks so much for a great talk. I'm joining you here with my own choice of tipple, a little redbreast. So it is.
Oh, that's nice.
New territory for me to be drinking this time of the evening, but I said I'd make an exception. No, I just wanted to maybe mention that in Gaelic tradition or in Irish tradition, sometimes the wise woman of Gaelic tradition can induce an altered state of consciousness using whiskey. We have evidence of this in the National Folklore Collection. I'm thinking particularly of maybe Joan Grogan of County Limerick, who used to use whiskey to produce, and I'm quoting from the National Folklore Collection here now, to produce at will by drinking a small drop of whiskey, a trance. And further then, she had to get whiskey, and this would get her into a fit. After drinking it, she would then tell what to do, so she would be able to foretell. So if you like, whiskey was being used to help the wise woman to if you like, negotiate between this world and the next world, to be that intermediary between this world and the next world, which might have some interesting connections with shamanism in a broader kind of a context.
Absolutely. I think it probably did, because if you look at how much shamanism is about getting into an altered state, and if you don't have mushrooms or peyote, then what are you going to use? You have to use alcohol.
Yeah. Very good.
Somebody said they would like to know who the first tribe that categorised mushrooms of, this one will kill you, this one tastes like beef, and this one will make you see God for a week. How did someone find that out?
Very good. Thanks a million.
Thank you for coming.
Maria?
Hi there. Thanks a million, Jenny. Thank you, Rachel, as well. That was absolutely fascinating. Lots in there to think about and mull over. I'm just wondering, I'm not quite sure if I missed the bit where you talked about the E in the whiskey, the Scottish whiskey spelling, sorry, the Irish spelling as opposed to the Scottish. Did you mention that?
No, I actually didn't, because again, didn't really think it didn't really have much to do with religion. There is a reason, and I think the Dubliners are to blame, as they are to blame for everything. I think they started putting an E in with their whiskey. So in the 19th century, the big selling whiskey was Irish whiskey rather than Scotch whiskey, because Scotch whiskey was seen as too smoky, and because the Irish triple distilled and the Scottish still double distilled. The Irish whiskey was much more consistent, and Dubliners wanted to say that their whiskey was better than the rest of Irish whiskey, so they started putting an E in their whiskey. Now, exactly, and then there was a law passed in about 1909, might not be 1909, but it was kind of around that time, about what exactly whiskey was, and it was like a British Isles wide law, and in the law they've got an EY in the whiskey, but exactly why the Irish only have an E all the time, and exactly why the Scottish have a Y and no E all the time, the minutes to that meeting got lost because nobody can find out exactly who decided this and when and why. It just kind of seemed to happen.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really great to hear. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And for the minutes of this meeting, we should clarify, if anybody's tuning in on YouTube, that we're talking about the spelling, about putting an E in your whiskey. So thanks so much, Rachel, for your wonderful talk. I think that's just opened up so much that we can think about religion and alcohol in different ways, and sacred substances. So thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. It was really interesting.